This Choircast podcast episode is brought to you by Returning to Eden, a field guide for the spiritual journey. Returning to Eden is a book by Heather Hamilton for people who resonate with aspects of Christianity but struggle with the coherence of its claims. You can purchase Returning to Eden by Heather Hamilton at Amazon.com or at returningtoeden.com. This
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Second Cup with Keith. I'm your host, Keith Giles, going live on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Just realized I had muted myself. Still adventures in self-producing here. Oh my gosh, one of these days we're going to dial it in, but thank you for your patience. Thank you all for being a part of this. I promised in the last episode, last week, that I was going to talk about, because I touched on this a tiny bit. I touched on this idea of the eternal now and the idea that time is an illusion. So to me, those are two separate conversations. And I'm going to do my best to sort of walk us through some of these concepts. And they may take some thinking, right? You may have to focus a little bit or chew on this a little bit. And you might even have to listen to this more than once. But I'm going to try to walk us through, what do I mean when I say that time is an illusion, or that everything is now? So, full disclosure, I probably should just come out and be upfront about this. Everything I'm going to walk you through right here, right now, I'm taking notes from and taking questions from a really great video clip by a guy named Rupert Spira. And it's one of the best things I've ever seen. He's at a conference and a little kid asks him a question. And he just walks this little kid through a series of questions that helps to illustrate the idea that time is an illusion and that everything is now. So I'm going to do my best to sort of recreate some of that here and hopefully walk you through this thought process. And hopefully this is going to be helpful. Okay, so let's give it a shot. I guess the first question would be, think about a moment in the past. And it can be the recent past. It could be this morning when you got up and got dressed and sat down. Maybe you had breakfast, maybe you had coffee, maybe you drove to work, whatever it is. But think of an event, maybe just brushing your teeth this morning, right? Think of a moment in the very recent past. Okay. Now, I want you to go there, and I don't mean remember it. I mean I want you to go back to that exact moment. Can you do that? Could you go to the past, in other words? Can you go to a moment in the past, even just not that long ago, 10 minutes ago, 30 minutes ago, an hour ago? Can you go back to that moment, and can you experience the past? Well, if you think about it, the answer is no. Not just because you don't have a time machine, but because even if you did have a time machine and you went back to a moment in the past, would you be experiencing the past? Or would that experience be happening in the now? It would be happening in the now, right? So that leads us to another question. Have you ever experienced anything other than now? No. Everything you've ever experienced, you experienced it in the now. Has anyone ever experienced anything outside of now? No. Can anybody experience the past? I don't mean remember the past. I don't mean recall the past. I don't mean imagine it. I mean go there. Can anyone go to the past and experience the past? No. And it's not just, again, the limitation of science, because science hasn't invented a device to take us there. I'm saying, let's say you've got a time machine and you go back to the past. Are you experiencing the past or are you experiencing now? That experience you have is in the now, because every experience you have ever had is now. And the only experience anyone has ever had is now. So let me ask you a different question. How many nows have you ever experienced? Now that's a bit of a trick question. In other words, can you discern when one now ends and the next now begins? No, right? So there's only one now. We've all only ever had one experience, and that experience is called now. Um, we uh, we experience. I should say we experience. It's not the way we experience. Our brains sort of create an illusion that, and we would communicate that we believe that the way reality works is that our now experience is sort of moving through time. Okay. And that at one point my now was in the past, and right now my now is in the now, but one day, maybe in 10 minutes, my now will be in the future. But again, that's the way we construct reality to sort of make sense of it in our heads. But if we think about it, what we realize is that's not true. Think of it this way. Let me get another question. If that's true, if reality is you're experiencing a series of nows that are moving from the past into the future, how quickly is your now moving through time? How quickly? It's not. Again, if you think about it, you realize now isn't moving at all. So it's not a series of nows. It's not one now is ending and the next now is beginning. It's just now. And if you think about it and just sort of try to imagine it and think about, if it's true that reality is you're now moving through time, you can't express or even imagine how quickly that now is moving through time. There's no way to express that. That's because it isn't moving through time. You only have now, right? And so your now, let's put it this way, the now that you are experiencing this moment is not a fraction of a moment. It is the totality of all reality, is this moment now. That is reality. Your reality is this moment right here. This is your reality. And it's an illusion that time is taking place. Again, our brains construct this illusion to help us make sense of our limitation. Our brains struggle to make sense of an eternal now. And so we have constructed a narrative, a story. We can draw a picture, the past, the present, the future, as if all three of these things exist equally. There is a past, there is a now, and there is a future. But none of us have ever None of us can ever go to the past and experience the past, because if we did, it would still be now. And of course, the same is true of the future. If I go to the future, it's now. Going to the future means I'm taking now with me wherever I go, because now is the true reality. The past is the imagined reality. The future is an imagined reality. The now, the eternal present, is the only reality that's truly real. It's the only thing we ever actually experience. You and I have never had an experience in the past. It was an experience in the now. And every experience you have is in the now. Right? That's why you can't answer the question, how quickly is now moving through time? It isn't. Now isn't moving. Now isn't going anywhere. Now just is, and it always is. So this now, there's only one, right? I could say, how many nows are there? Well, there's just one. And how long does now last? Think about it. So your now experience, you are currently having at this very moment, how long does it last? If you had to measure your now, how long does it last? Man, that's a good one to think about. I think meditating on that question could break your brain. How long does your now experience last? On some levels, you could say it's like that. But I think if you would say it's happening in a blip, in a flash, you're still imagining a series of nows that are, now, because your brain is still telling you that you're moving through time in a series of nows. But again, if that's true, how long does now last? And how many now experiences have you had? Have you had you've had 100 billion now experiences? Or you've just had one? Even since I started this podcast, how many now experiences have you had? Just the one. The only one you've got. There's only one now, and you are experiencing it. I'm experiencing it. When? When do I experience now? Now. So again, it's what we're doing when we're trying to think this way and shift our perspectives this way is we're sort of retraining our brains to reimagine reality in a different way. That's really hard to do. I would say it's almost impossible for us to do, right? But let's recap. You and I have never experienced anything other than now. You and I could never experience anything other than now. We can't experience the past or the future, because if we do, we're in the now. We're not in the past, we're not in the future. How many nows do we experience? One. How quickly is your now moving through time? Again, trick question, because it's not moving through time. We're going to get to time in a second. We're going to talk about the illusion of time in a second. But right now, I'm just talking about now. And your now experience is not a fraction of a moment. It's just the moment, the present moment. The experience of now is all you and I have. Now isn't moving through time. So we can't talk about how quickly it's moving, because it's not moving. It stays right here. Your now is always right here. It's always in front of you. It's always right here. And so how many moments, how many nows have you experienced in your lifetime? One. This one. This now is your only experience. And how long does now last? Again, sort of a trick question. Since it's not moving through time, since it's not a series of moments, it doesn't last because it never goes away. It doesn't begin and end. There's not a beginning and a middle and an end to your now experience. It just always is. Now, So the truth is, again, going back to the thing about the past and the future, we don't really experience time. Again, time is an illusion. It seems to exist, right? So this is the reason why. Here's just a very practical example. When you go to sleep, you lay down in bed, turn off the lights, put your head in the pillow, get all snuggly and warm under the covers. At some point, you fall asleep. When do you wake up? At the exact moment that you fell asleep. You don't experience time when you're asleep because time is an illusion. Your mind creates the illusion, and therefore, when you're awake, you're operating in this illusion of time. When you close your eyes and you go to sleep, your mind shuts off so that when quote unquote, time has passed. But when you open your eyes and you wake up, it feels like it's the same exact second that you closed them. The same exact second that you fell asleep is the very moment you woke up. Because reality is now, right? That illusion of time is sort of short-circuited in your brain because your mind isn't creating that illusion, right? Your true experience is always now. So I know, again, this is super deep stuff. And but again, I think it's something that we have to get our brains around. I'm going to take a second here and do a little pitch because I talk about this kind of stuff. I have 2 books that I wrote in the Sola series, Sola Mysterium, Celebrating the Beautiful Uncertainty of Everything. I talk about this kind of things and many other things. I talk about frequency. I talk about time. I talk about our brains. I talk about perception, placebos, quantum physics and science, mysticism, so many things. And I got to say, I'm super, super proud of this book. It's one of the favorite things I've ever done. And I know right now my book, The Quantum Sayings of Jesus, it's back to number 1 today. We dropped to number 2 for a couple of days, but we're back to number 1 now, and I'm so excited about that. And so, yeah, I'm very excited that the Quantum Sayings of Jesus book about the Gospel of Thomas is doing so well. And I know a lot of people have told me how much they enjoy the book. But I got to say, I wish Sola Mysterium was number 1 and stayed number 1 because I think this book is probably one of the best things I've ever written. And I'm super proud of it. And I'm very, very proud as well of the follow-up book, Sola Deus, What If God Is All of Us, which is really just a continuation of the ideas the groundwork that I lay in Sola Mysterium. We go into much more discussions in Sola Deus about our connection with God, our shared divinity. What is that like? I ask a lot of questions. The difference between panentheism and pantheism, and ultimately, if there really is a difference, is there some sort of a paradox going on there? But I also talk about this idea of, it's really, this book is really more about the idea of our shared humanity and shared divinity. But again, it's a companion to Sola Mysterium, and I'm super proud of this book too. I really am. And so I wish that both of these books would get the love that I feel like they deserve. Super proud. Also in Sola Deus, I talk about, and this is really important, I talk about spiral dynamics and sort of raising our consciousness into the Christ consciousness and that kind of thing, and how that happens, and the fact that we can prove that it does happen and has happened throughout history. But anyway, I mentioned those 2 books because I go into a lot more, so if this stuff is interesting to you and fascinating to you, I'd really recommend reading Sola Mysterium. And then after you read Sola Mysterium, pick up Sola Deus and finish that sort of, journey, those kinds of ways of thinking and shifting our ways, our paradigm shift of ways of seeing and thinking. So yeah, thank you. Hani Holland says, wonderful book. Thank you so much. Yes. All right. I knew someone was going to say this. So Svenborg Nygaard, I'm sorry if I'm ruining your name there. His comment is, but the mind keeps working while we're sleeping. We dream and so forth. Yes. So that I knew someone was going to bring that up about dreaming. When you're dreaming, is that happening in the past or in the future, or is it happening now? Right? So even when you're dreaming, that dream is now, right? You're experiencing that dream now. Yeah. Judy Springsteen says, "Good morning, coming in 15 minutes late. I love this stuff." Yeah, that's okay. I started the podcast 30 minutes late. I was going to start it at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, and I was researching all this stuff, and I was like, I'm going to need more time, so I bumped it to 10:30. So it's okay. Yeah, and I'm sorry I ignored some of the questions. Some of the answers to the questions here, but people basically in the comments were saying things like, "It's only now." Terrestrial Traveler said. I asked the question, how long does now take? And it says, not even as long as it takes to ask the question. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's this, it's not even an instant, really, at least to me. In my experience of the now, it is not an instant. Again, it's not a series of moments sort of chained together, connected together, moving through this illusion of time. It's a sort of wide open sort of a sphere where it is peace and calm, and it's where I in my full humanity and full divinity connection with the divine, where I'm experiencing myself and I'm experiencing reality, and that doesn't have time. That doesn't have, there's no way to measure this. There's no way to, the only thing you can do with now is experience it. You can't measure how long it takes. You can't measure how fast it's going through time, because again, nothing's going through time. Time itself is an illusion. And I want to talk a little bit about that in a second too, because this part of it is really, a lot of it really is, I don't want to say philosophical, because a lot of times for us, philosophical, that term sort of takes on the idea that we're just talking about concepts, when I think we're actually talking about reality. But it's something that we have to do with our mind, with our brain, and it's a shift, right? So maybe it's psychological, but it's a necessary thing to ask ourselves these questions and really think about and meditate on these things. But when it comes to time, let's say from a scientific standpoint, scientists, especially quantum scientists, but even going back all the way to Albert Einstein, have all said the same thing. Looking at the concept of time through the lens of mathematics, through the lens of quantum physics, through the lens even of philosophy, what they're saying is time does not exist. That it's something that we construct to make sense of the reality around us. Again, I like to say our brains have a limitation in that it's very difficult for our minds, for our brains, to wrap around this concept of an eternal now. And so the concept of time and moving through time and the past and the future, those are things we invent, we create to make sense of reality. But it is not reality in itself. The reality, and it's demonstrable, provable, the reality is just now. So the great philosopher Aristotle once said, this is a quote from him: "Time is the most unknown of all unknown things." And that was like 2,500 years ago, right? But I would say it's still true. And again, some of the smartest people who have ever lived cannot explain how time works or what time is. We can conceptualize it, we can express it mathematically, but we cannot prove it in reality. So what we believe about time is that it's a dimension, but it's also a measurement, right? In other words, it helps us, time is a concept. It helps us understand something that happens or that did happen, that helps us sort of conceptualize how long something lasted or how far away in the past it took place. But space, like time, is a dimension. And we can move through space, right? I can go from here. I can go from this room to the next room. I can go from El Paso to California. I can move through space in any direction. But time, as we understand it, we can only move through time in one direction, forward, right? Again, now we're going back to the construct, right? So let's go back to this idea of time. Let's play with this idea that time is real, and that there's a past, and there's a now, and there's a future, and we are moving through time. Okay. Again, I don't think we are, but as far as we know it, it's not possible to go forward into the future or to go back to the past. And again, Albert Einstein said this, that time and space are modes by which we think and not conditions in which we live. Okay, that's an important quote for us to think about. Because again, he's saying that based on physics, based on science, based on mathematics, that when we really look at it, time and space are not conditions in which we live, but they are modes in which we think. So that means even though we all experience time as this linear process, again, well, we don't really experience it. I shouldn't say that. We all think we experience. We're all convinced that we experience time as a linear process where one moment is followed by the next moment and the next moment and the next moment. And as these build on each other, we construct a past, we have a present, and we're moving into a future, right? But that is not how time itself operates. What Einstein is suggesting is that time may not exist at all as a fundamental property of the universe. It's what they call an emergent property, meaning the universe is reality, and time is something that is created by our consciousness as beings within the universe. Okay. So what's the difference? Well, emergent properties don't exist in any individual component of a system. Okay. Sorry for the scientific talk here, but they do exist for the system as a whole. So individual water molecules, hopefully this is a helpful concept to understand what I'm saying. Individual water molecules are not wet. If I could hand you a single water molecule, you would not get wet. Does that understand what I'm saying? So also, individual water molecules don't respond to the movements of the tides. They don't behave the way water itself behaves. But the entire ocean does feel wet, right? And the ocean is expressed and moved by the tides, or the motion of the tides. A better example might be for us to conceive of this is the way a film, when you go watch a film, what you are experiencing is an illusion. You think you're watching people move and cars driving and people jumping, and that's what your brain tells you you're experiencing and what you're seeing. But if you could take the film that you're watching, again, because you're watching a film, so go upstairs to the projection booth, let's just pretend they could let you do that. You could touch the film, you could turn it off, you could pick it up, you could unroll the spool, the strip of film, you could hold it up to the light, and you would notice that everything you just watched, that you experienced as motion, was just a series of individual photographs. It's a series of individual pictures. And when we put those individual pictures together and we move them at a certain speed, it creates the illusion. Your brain fills in those gaps. You ignore the difference between this picture and that picture, and you make them one picture. You make it smooth. You make it move, right? That's happening in your brain, right? It's not actually what's happening. So the film seems to reflect motion and the passage of time, but the truth is that's an illusion, right? Again, you could go upstairs to the film booth, you could take that and you could put your finger on any moment in the film and you could say, okay, there's that moment, but here's this moment over here. And if you did that, let's say you said, okay, I'm going to put my finger on the beginning of the movie And I'm going to roll it out over here and I'm going to put my finger in the middle of the movie. Okay. Both of those actions of touching the first frame of the film and touching the middle frame of the film are happening when? Now. And I could play the movie backwards, right? I could play the ending and then the beginning. So again, there's an illusion of time, right? The reality is each individual frame of film is completely motionless. The picture is motionless. It never changes. It's not moving. It's staying right there. The passage of time and the motion we experience when we watch the film, those are emergent properties of the way we perceive still images when they're projected through with a light on a screen and it's run at 24 frames per second. So the question Einstein is asking is, could the physics of time somehow be a similar illusion? It's an illusion. Could it be that what we see and even experience as the passage of time moving forward from past to present to future is not reality? And I would say he's right. It's not reality. There's no reason for us to assume that time, number one, that it exists, and that if it did exist, that it would only flow in one direction, right? So we perceive time, we might even say we create the illusion of time as a linear thing, as something that is moving in one direction. But time isn't. Time, again, time and space, they just are. We experience the dimension of space as we move through the space, as I go from this side of the room to that side of the room, right? But we never experience all of space at one time. Only the area of space we happen to be in at the moment. And the same would be true of time. Time extends in every direction at once, like space. It's also why in physics you talk about time and space sometimes almost interchangeably. You can't talk about time without talking about space, and vice versa, right? Time and space go together. And so time, like space, extends into every direction at once, not just from the past to the future, but from the future, what we call the future, to the past, and up and down and left and right. Okay, it's a 3-4-dimensional concept. But we seem to only experience time where we are in the moment, the same way we'd experience space where I am in the moment. I experience this space in this moment. I experience time in this moment. But in both cases, what you are experiencing is now. You're experiencing now because now is your only experience. And space and time are both these 3-dimensional things. So that means anyone's perception of either is relative to their experience, but their individual experience of either one is not the totality of it. So the way we experience time is part of the problem. We experience time in a linear fashion. We tend to believe that all that exists is this present moment. The past is erased and the future is a void that's going to be filled up in the future. The answer is assumed to be whatever we experience in the ever-flowing blink. Again, these are constructions, right? What we think is an eye blink between the past and the future. We call that the present. We call that the now. But quantum physics suggests that the future and the past both exist eternally right now. You're just not experiencing all of it. But time and space all exist now. So in other words, if the only experience you ever have is now, all that exists is now. There's nothing other than now. Right? The future and the past, they both exist eternally. Right? So Isaac Newton, he's called the father of Newtonian physics. He taught us that it was possible to measure and even predict the position and velocity of every particle in the universe, leading to this deterministic view of reality, right? And he thought it was possible to prove that everyone was experiencing the same absolute, clearly definable moment called now. But today's quantum physicists now know that Newton was totally wrong about that. he assumed that all particles, all observers, all points in space were ruled by a single, constantly ticking universal clock. In other words, Newton assumed that time was real and we were all bound to this clock, this time, this linear conception of time. But if that was true, that would mean it would be possible to define a notion of now that we could all agree on. Now we're getting a little crazy. In other words, your now might not be my now. Think about that, right? Everything I've talked about so far has been your individual experience of what now is, right? But your now isn't my now. What you're experiencing right now is your experience of now. And what I'm experiencing now is my experience of now. We may not, in fact, it would almost be impossible for everyone to agree on now. And how would we define that? What was that like? But with quantum physics, scientists, they now know there is no one single universal clock in the universe. Okay. And it's very difficult, and I would say possibly, impossible. It's impossible to accurately predict the position and velocity of every particle in the universe. Not because we don't have big enough computers, but because the universe by nature is unpredictable, right? Because again, we know this from quantum physics. When you observe an electron, when you look at a photon, when you look at a proton or a molecule or any other quantum particles, observing that particle changes it. If you're looking at it, it behaves one way. If you're not observing it, it behaves a different way. So which is reality? Why does it change depending on whether you're observing it or not? Is reality what's happening when you're not looking at it? Or is reality what's happening when you are looking at it? Or is reality both? Reality is when you're not looking, and reality is when you are looking. Well, that then means there's an unpredictability, there's a randomness to this, right? There's like, what's going on, right? So, yeah, that's pretty amazing. Bottom line is we know that Newton was wrong. We do not live in a deterministic universe, okay? And we can't predict those two things, position and velocity, at all. To get super detailed, actually, I would say if you're curious about another book that deals with this, again, I highly recommend Sola Mysterium and Sola Deus, because I've read a lot of these things and I've done my best to make it more understandable and digestible, and right. But if you want to go deeper in this, there's a great book called The Self-Aware Universe by Amit Goswami that goes into some of this as well. Yeah. So anyway, further studies have found that time itself doesn't only follow one predetermined path, but again, now we're getting to multiverse ideas, right? That time exists all at once across all possible dimensions of space. And we can play with whether or not we can question whether that's even true or not as well. Maybe that isn't possible either. Or maybe there are an infinite number of nows and an infinite number of yous across all reality. In other words, like reality is vastly more complex than we can conceive of it, which is partly why our brains, just to survive on this planet and get through our day and get through our life experience on this planet, has to shut all this stuff out. We can't walk around all day thinking about these things. So we construct past, present, future. We construct this feeling, this illusion of moving through time, right? But again, going back to that idea, we imagine that we're moving through time, but we're not. We are only here now. We are only experiencing now. So the past and the present and the future, they all sort of exist now. And that is kind of what quantum physics is saying, is that we may be experiencing it and it feels like we're moving through something traveling through this experience of reality. But if you could pull back, if you could zoom out and conceive of the entirety of time and space, and this is impossible, but just again, imagine your imagination, what you would see is one enormous now. That the past and the present and the future all exist at one time. It's already there. Now, then you zoom in to you as one individual consciousness in the universe. You are having experiencing of now, and you only experience now. Again, you've never experienced the past, because when you were experiencing what you call the past, you were experiencing now. And you will never go to the future, because to go to the future, you'd have to leave the now. And what you're calling the future is just a continuation of the now. Like, you shouldn't even say continuation, because again, that gives the illusion that it's moving. It's not moving. It's just now. So your now isn't moving. You haven't had multiple now experiences. You just have this one. And this now experience that you're currently having, you will continue to have. And I think this also then hopefully helps us understand this question of what happens after we die. Because again, we know from quantum physics that energy cannot be, and matter, energy cannot be destroyed, right? It can change form. So ultimately, you are a consciousness. You are energy. You are, you exist. You are the consciousness right now having this experience. And when your physical body, which is not you, it's you drive this body around, you're operating this body, you're sort of housed within it in the moment, but that isn't you. When the body dies, your consciousness, the consciousness that is currently experiencing this now, and this now which is always here and was always been here and is all that you've ever experienced, will continue to experience now after you're gone. So this experience of now that you currently have is the experience you will always have. Now, that experience itself might expand your awareness of yourself, your awareness of the universe, your awareness of your divine connection and your connection with all other consciousness in the universe. That can expand. But when it does, it will only, that expansion will only be happening now. It's just an enrichment of your current now experience. But it doesn't end. It doesn't end. The now that you're experiencing now, because it's not moving through time, like it doesn't have a beginning and an end, it's just now. It continues to be now. Our experience, again, is always now. I've written a lot about this. I don't want to get too deep into the time thing, because I think it can start to confuse us in some ways. Like I did write about this in, I think this was in Solo Mysterium. I talked about this, like trying to conceptualize this illusion of time, right? So like if time is not linear, okay, then the way we need to rethink about ourselves as human beings who exist within this dimension of now, so for example, the way we sort of by default think about the passing of time, I see myself as a person who exists in this moment right now, okay? But is who I am in this moment the totality of me? Because isn't it also true that if I could pull back and see my life from birth to death, aren't I also alive in 1966 when I was born? Like if I could pull back and just look at time, well, there I am. That's me. I'm alive in 1966. And that's me. Well, am I also alive in 1975? Well, if I could look at time, I could jump into time again as a constructed thing with a beginning, middle, and end. Isn't that me right there in 1975? That's me too. Yeah. And is this me in 1999? Yep, that's me right there in 1999. And is this me over here in 2005? Yep, that's also me. So how many me's are there? How many Keiths are there? There's just one Keith, right? And if I could go into the future, you know, can I jump ahead to like when I'm 70 or 80 or however old I'm going to get? Is that me too? Yes. And if I could look at time like that, I'm alive. Keith is alive in 2030. Keith is alive in 1966. Keith is alive in 1975. Keith is alive in 1999. Keith is alive in 2007. Keith is alive in all of these timelines. All of them are me. But if I look at them as snapshots, if I look at them as photographs, right? The me in 1966 is a tiny baby. The me in 1975 is a little kid. The me in 1999 is a 20-something guy with a beard and with some kids. The me in 2007 is a much older guy, right? The me in 2000, the me in 2040 or whatever is a very old guy. They don't look like the same person. They don't look like the same being, but they are. They're all me. And if time is an illusion, they're all me right now. Now I'm really breaking your brain. It's almost like, okay, think of it this way. Here's another analogy. I try to use this sometimes. If I had an apple sitting on a counter and you said, hey, Keith, hand me that apple. And I took out a knife and I sliced the apple in half. And then I just sliced from the inside a very thin slice of that apple from the middle of the apple and I gave it to you. You'd say, that's not the apple. So yes, but when you asked me for the apple, it was the now. So it was, this part of the apple was the past and this other part of the apple is in the future. But you asked me for the apple in a moment. You said, give me the apple. Can you hand me that apple? And the apple that existed in that moment was this little sliver, right? I just cut that, right? That's like my life. If you said, okay, which one is Keith? Oh, this one here right now. But the other one's not Keith over there in the past. And this other one over here in the future, that's not Keith. They're all me, right? So again, time distorts our understanding of reality. In other words, now isn't this moment as if it's a blip. Now is this expansive thing that is that covers everything, right? All at once. And yet it's all now. Each of those things are now, right? When I was a baby, that was now. When I was 12 years old, that was now. When I was 21, that was now. And this is now. It's always now. All of it is now. What confuses us is to break it up like that, to put it on a graph and to try to map it out this way. Well, this was the past and this is the present and that's going to be the future. But that isn't our experience. No one has ever experienced the past. We have only always experienced the now. And that's all there is now. And who you are now is who you are, no matter what time it is, no matter what your experience of time might be, right? All right, so I'm gonna go back here and try to look at some concepts. Judy Springsteen says, truth is aren't late, everything is now. That's right. Truth isn't late, I think I was trying to say. Michael Garcia says, I appreciate all your work. Everything is lining up and making sense. I'm glad it makes sense to you. Because you could say it's very confusing on one level if you're trying to think the old way. But if you let yourself, it makes complete sense, even though to that other part of your brain, it's confusing, right? Yeah, Judy says we can also expand time. Yeah, because it's an illusion, right? Terrestrial Traveler says modes in which we think. Yes, okay. Judy says it's perception. Yes. Again, Terrestrial Traveler says, I love the water molecule example. Yeah. Judy says our minds are so powerful. Let's see. Yeah, that's an interesting. So Sven says, our bodies change, grow, and wither, so our body is set in time. Yeah, I think again, like it's the difference between our conception of now and the way we have constructed time, right? So physical things in the universe change, right? There's a life cycle, birth, life, death, right? Um, but our consciousness doesn't change, doesn't experience that, right? Um, and by putting this construct of this awareness of time over our perception of reality, we limit all of reality. That it's just so much bigger than we can comprehend it. And so we get confused by what we're seeing in the world around, the physical world around us, and we say, okay, this is reality. But if we again stop and think and ask those questions of ourselves, how many nows have you ever experienced? Just this one, right? There's only one, right? So yeah, the terrestrial traveler says eternity is now. Yes, there is an eternal now that we can experience. This is also, I think, why meditation is so important, because when we meditate, we block out all of those perceptions that are coming through our senses, right? Our eyes, our ears, what's stimulating our brains and filtered through this illusion that we've created in our heads. When you're meditating, again, you're pushing all that stimuli out, and you're more capable of really focusing on now, that this is your only experience. And in the now, you experience yourself, your consciousness, your true self, and that connection you have with the divine, which again is timeless. When we talk about God being timeless, right? God exists outside of time. God existed before time existed. God created time, if you want to think of it that way. When creation was made, that's where time was created. That's not exactly true, but without creation, would there be time? No, there'd be eternity, because it would only be God. And God exists in an eternal now. It's always now. No beginning, no end, just now. Right? And so the universe that we're living in, it really also isn't bound by time, but our experience of it is. And the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of it, we've invented this concept called time to make sense of it. Right? John Sinke. So does God observe this eternal now? And does he know the future completely? That is a tough question. And I think answering that question boils down to, how do you conceive of God? Probably more so than how you conceive of time. Okay. This is why I think people should read Sola Deus, because I really deal with this in Sola Deus. I think if you're raised as in a evangelical Christian faith, as I was, and I'm sure as the majority of you watching this were, we have been indoctrinated with the idea that God is separate from us. God existed before we did. God is the ultimate consciousness, the ultimate creator. And then God created us as separate beings outside of God. This is why when we pray, we are talking to that being up there, out there somewhere. And we're wanting that other being, that other consciousness, to come down here and intervene with here and change things in our world, right? We also tend to anthropomorphize that God. Ultimately, the way we conceive of that separate God up there, out there, is that concept of God is sort of it's the ultimate human, right? That God has emotion, but it's pure emotion, right? Pure love, pure peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, love, right? Some people in that conception would say God is also wrath because we have wrath. So that being also must have wrath, but it must be an infinite wrath and an infinite love. And so we attribute human characteristics to that separate being, and that separate being is really an ultimate human, right? And to get really granular for a lot of, especially Christians, it's an ultimate man. It's male. That is one way to think about God. And I've wrestled a lot with this. And in Sola Deus, I really wrestle with this. And so, but as I'm moving more into this idea that that all of reality is the divine consciousness. Okay. Again, what quantum science is saying, what all the mystics are saying. There's the quantum field is everything, and everything is the quantum field, right? Paul says Christ is all and is in all, and that Christ is the one in whom we all live and move and have our being. And I would say, if that's true, if Christ is the one in whom we all live and move and have our being, then I am the one and we are the ones in whom Christ lives and moves and has Christ's being. That you cannot separate Christ from us. Christ is the vine, we are the branches. Where does the vine end and the branch begin? I can't tell you. When Jesus says in the Gospel of John, in that day, you are going to get it. You're going to finally realize this powerful truth. You're going to say to yourself, you're going to say, oh, I am in the Father and I am in you and you are in me. So now we should stop thinking about God as up there, out there, somewhere, ultimate human, anthropomorphized, ultimate human being, separate from us. So now if I were to look at problems in the world, let's say, and say, God, how could you let this happen? God, why aren't you doing something about this? Who am I talking to? Well, I'm talking to that guy up there, out there. Hey, come down here and do stuff down here. Change our reality here. But I would say the reality is that when I'm doing that, I'm talking to myself. I'm talking to the divine that is within me and within all of us. That again, yes, we can look at injustice and say that's wrong. God should do something about that. But where is God? Up there or here? And again, we have to rethink this, right? In every way, I'm talking about the separation between the now and time. There's a separation between God and me. And I need to erase that separation. I need to recognize there is no separation. So the part of me calling out to a divine being to use that divine power to do something to stop and change what I see that's wrong in the world is I'm talking to myself and I'm talking to all of us because there is no separation between us and the divine. Okay. I say all that to say, in answer to your question, John, does God observe this eternal now? And does God know the future completely? Only if you think of God as a separate being from you and me. And it's a separate consciousness that can then observe these things and then have separate feelings and thoughts and knowledge apart from being us, being humanity, being all consciousness in the universe, right? If you take the view of a separate God, and I'm not saying that's wrong, I'm just saying I don't anymore, then yes, of course, that separate being, that separate consciousness from the rest of us could observe this and know things we don't know and relate to us in a different way. But I'm moving more towards this idea that there is no separation. So I don't think there is a separate being or consciousness that operates independently from the rest of the universe, if that makes sense. Now, again, in Sola Deus, I do wrestle with this. Okay. I do think there is slightly a paradox because I do think there is a relationship between us and the divine consciousness, right? Not to say it's separate, but to say that there's a relationship. And that relationship seems to be the point of creation. That the reason why the divine consciousness created everything and anything was for the purpose of relationship. I wrote about this. I wrote a blog about this. In fact, I may have done a podcast on this, right? About this idea that when all is one, that is the great loneliness, right? That we are fragments of a lonely God. Because when everything is purely, perfectly one, that's the ultimate loneliness, right? There's no one but you. You're in eternal, endless loneliness. And so creation is to create these separate billions and billions and billions of separate expressions of the one divine consciousness so that there can be relation between, there can be relationships, right? Because there can't be relationships if we're all one. But we are all one. But creation is a way for us to, it's a way for the divine to create an experience of oneness and connection that otherwise would be impossible, right? So in some ways, creation and the reality we're currently experiencing in itself is an illusion but it's a necessary one. It's one that is necessary so that the divine consciousness can escape this, eternal loneliness, right? So we are the divine experiencing the divine. We are the divine experiencing the divine in all these myriad of expressions of the consciousness. So it's, in a way, it's both and. The way I talk about it in Sola Deus is it isn't either or. Ultimately, because this is a conversation between is what's reality? Is it pantheism? Everything is God, or is it panentheism? God is in everything. And honestly, when I look at pantheism, there are reasons to think that that's true, but to a certain point, it breaks down again for me because of this relationship thing, right? It seems that there is this divine relationship that's so important and so necessary. Then when I look at panentheism, it makes sense to a certain point, but then it also begins to break down. And so for me, sort of the Venn diagram, the overlap between panentheism and pantheism is there's a paradox there. And again, the same way I cannot explain the Trinity, but I believed it for years and taught it, and I just, my opt out at the end of it was like, oh, no one can explain it. It's just true. It's just reality. It's just the way it is, right? It's a mystery. It's a paradox. I would say there's a mystery and there's a paradox between pantheism and panentheism. Somehow they're both true. I don't know exactly how. I don't know that we're ever going to totally, again, I can't draw this on a napkin. I don't think we can map that out. But I do think when we reach sort of the bleeding edge of, where pantheism sort of breaks down, where panentheism breaks down, somewhere in that gray space in the middle, they are both true. In other words, they are both true that God is in everything and God is everything. And again, I think it's because of this relationship factor that's necessary. Does that feed into heaven and hell is now? I wouldn't say so. Because again, I don't think that heaven and hell, if we think of them as afterlife experiences, technically there's no afterlife. Because there'll be a shift in your physical, what will happen to your physical body. It will wear out, it will expire, it'll decay, it'll evaporate, right? In a million years, the body you're in right now there'll be no trace of it. But you will, right? And your experience of now will continue to go on. I don't think there's a hellish experience. I don't think there's a heaven experience. I don't think those are two separate things. You go to here or you go to there, because I think all is one. I think our consciousness goes back to and awakens in the divine consciousness. And there might be a conversation there about what was that experience like? And maybe at some point, hey, let's do that again. That was fun. Or, hey, let's not do that again. That's good. I'm good for now. I don't know. And again, I think there's also a huge mystery about that. this conception of heaven and hell. And I've given you guys a whole lot to think about, so I apologize. I've dumped a whole bunch on you in this podcast. But hopefully, again, my whole goal is always just to get us to think and to challenge some of those things, right? John says, I think we live both in a unified and a fragmented now. Yeah, and it would be interesting to think about that, right? In what ways is it unified? And in what ways is it fragmented? Right? That can be another experiment or conversation down the road. Sven says, but for a reason, our consciousness is having this experience in time. If time is real. But what if time isn't real? Since it is placed in a body that changes through time. Yeah. It's placed in a body that changes. But is it changing in time? Is time the right concept? Is time the right way to think about that? If we start with reality is now, then we have to think of other ways to explain the rest of it. Is it just an extended now? And of course, even in my now experience, lots of things are happening, right? My now is an active now. It's not static. It's not sitting here. It's not unmoving. Just because I can't express the ways of it, quote unquote, moving through time. It's not moving through time. Yet I'm having all sorts of experiences. We're having this conversation. Okay. I'm going to drink some coffee. I'm wearing some headphones. When I'm done, I'm going to turn this off and get up and leave the room. Right. But everything that happens will be happening in now, in the moment of now, in the one single experience of now. Right. Things are happening, but they're always happening now. Right. John says, I don't know how to explain it in any other way except if our consciousness has a compound eye looking at us. There you go. Each snapshot of us is contained in one of consciousness' individual eyes. It's interesting, yeah, but I would say try to take that concept and expand it beyond yourself. What if you only have one eye in that compound eye, but all of the universe, all of reality is composed of a compound eye of limitless billions upon billions of other eyes in a single compound eye. And that single compound eye is God and the great consciousness and the universe, composed of individual tiny little compound eyes. That's a good analogy there. The lie of the garden, Genesis. Do you want to be like God and we fall and think we are maybe separate? I think so. So I don't think I've talked about this before. Like I think I did talk about this last time, right? The lie in the garden was when the serpent told Adam and Eve that they had to do something to be like God. When the text before that tells us the story that they are part of God. They were created by God. They were created. A lot of mystics and theologians will say that God did not create ex nihilo. God did not create out of nothing. That we are made of God. I think Julian of Norwich said that, or Saint Catherine, one of the Desert Mothers, one of the female mystics, said that we are not made. We're not merely made by God. We're made of God, and that God's breath is the breath of our life. Our life is made of God. Our consciousness is of God. And the lie of the serpent in the garden was, hey, if you do this other thing, that will make you like God. They already were, right? There was the lie of separation. You're separated from God right now. You're apart from God right now. You're not like God right now. If you do this other thing, we could fix that. And that was a lie. Michael Garcia says, since all we have is now, how do we realize grieving the Holy Spirit? That would mean a minute in the now would stop all thought of forgiveness. Doesn't that stop our time? We are cut off from God. Well, I would just say again, like we're not cut off from God. And Scripture tells us that. Even in the Old Testament, God says this, but he also continues this again through Jesus, through Paul, the apostles, the writings in the New Testament. Sin is in our head. Sin is our problem. It's not God's problem. Paul says we were separated from God in our minds, not in God's mind, in our minds, right? In the Old Testament, what does God say about sins? I have forgiven them. I remember them no more. I have cast them as far as the east is from the west. Paul says in 2 Corinthians that God was in Christ not counting our sins against us, but reconciling the world to himself. So good news, God is not counting your sins against you, no matter who you are. God is not counting your sins against you. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, love keeps no record of wrongs. There is no list anywhere in the universe, in God's mind or heart or a book or anything. God is not keeping a list of those things. God has not done that. God would not do that. He has forgotten them. He has cast them far away. He remembers them no more. Our focus is on sin. We're the ones who remember our own sins and other people's sins and hold it against them. We're the ones doing that. When Jesus told the disciples, right, I give you the keys of the kingdom, whatever you bound on earth will be bound on earth, whatever you will be bound in heaven, and vice versa. We're the ones doing that, not God. We're the ones binding people up here on earth, not God. No. And here's the beautiful thing about those keys he's given us. Those keys can bind people up or they can set people free. And if our concept of the kingdom is that, I talked about this last week, right? The good news, the gospel is the child of humanity is within you. The kingdom of God is within you. The Christ is in you. That means it's in everybody, not just you. And that gospel should set us free. Jesus said that the truth will set you free. And if the Son sets you free, if the Son of Man sets you free, you'll be free indeed. But if you're not free, it's probably because you or someone else has convinced you of things that are not true, that have bound you up. You're not free. You're stuck in a system that is all about binding you up. It's not focused on setting you free and keeping you free. That's my huge frustration with a lot of Christian churches is they begin every Sunday morning service by singing songs about what a worm and a wretch you are and how God can barely stand you and you're horrible and you're awful. And you're lucky God even looks at you. And then at the very end, you have a chance to be welcomed and loved and jump through these hoops and pray these prayers and come forward and bend the knee and get baptized and blah, blah, blah. Hallelujah. You're loved. You're accepted. You're finally one with God again. Yeah, but you're going to screw it up again. So come back next week and we'll go through the whole merry-go-round again. We'll go through the revolving door over and over and over and over again. That is not good news. That's a system that is not interested in setting you free and keeping you free and saying and declaring you are free. You are one with Christ. Christ is all and is in all. That's the truth. That's the reality. We're the ones focused on sin. God is not. Terrestrial Traveler says 1 molecule in the sea. That's right. And then she says, Keith, you flushed out the picture I drew yesterday. Thank you. Wow, that's cool. You drew a picture yesterday. Putting words to pictures in my brain is a goal of mine. Thanks for being a part of that. Well, thank you. We think of heaven and hell as afterlife, but I argue that's not biblical. Exactly. Yeah. It's really true. Actually, I had a friend of mine who was working on he was going to write a paper, I think, for school about heaven. And he said, hey, Keith, can you what are some verses you can give me that describe heaven? I was like, the truth is there's not a lot. Not very much at all, actually. Not very much at all. We, Paul, I think, says it best. Like, we don't know. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard, what that's going to be like. Which, by the way, that verse, when Paul says that, is a quote from the Gospel of Thomas. Because even when he says that, he says, as it is written, which is the way you would quote scripture. And then he quotes Thomas. So I talk about that in the Quantum Sayings of Jesus. So fascinating reality there that Paul is aware of the saying of Jesus from Thomas and quotes it. And it's talking about the fact that no one knows what that's going to be like. So yeah, there's a lot of mystery about that. What saved my soul was thinking that it is a given that there are no contradictions in the Bible. Contradiction is something lacking in how I'm thinking. It keeps me on the quest, which means the joy of this journey. Very cool. It's difficult to talk about contradictions in the Bible because the Bible is not one thing. It's not one book written by one person. It's a series of books written by many people, most of them who did not know each other, and they're all giving you their experience of the divine. So their experience is their experience. They, if that's their experience of the divine, well, that was true for them in that moment, but they don't agree. There is not agreement. The Bible contradicts itself in that sense quite often. In other words, one person's experience is not exactly the same as another person's experience. And that's consistent actually throughout the Bible. I'm sorry to break that to you. It's kind of scary to say that sometimes. If your faith is in the Bible, I would say it should not be in the Bible. God did not write the Bible. We did. People did. Human beings wrote the Bible. Again, that's not bad, but you understand it's their experience of the divine, which can be right in some cases, and other times they can get it wrong. Because all of us are filtering our experience of the divine through our filters, right? We can't help that. We all have these filters and these lenses, and most of us are oblivious to them. Okay, let me see. John says, I've come to hope that the list God holds is how do I love you? Let me count the ways. Ooh, that's beautiful. I like that. There you go. That's good. But God is love, right? What is God? God is love. God cannot help but love because it's what makes God God, right? And there's no question of, do you deserve God's love, right? I've said this many times, like asking if you and I deserve the love of God is asking if the sky deserves to be blue. It just is. Blue is what the sky is. Loved is what you are. There's no deserving. The sky doesn't deserve to be blue. It just is blue. You don't deserve to be loved because there's no deserving of love when you are created by love, because God is love, in the image of God, which is love. So you're created by love in the image of love. Why? To be loved. You just are loved. There's no deserving. The same way the sky doesn't deserve to be blue, and it's not even a question. You don't have to deserve it. It's just who you are. That's reality. So I thank you for taking this journey with me through this deep and quite often very confusing and convoluted concept. I would just say, if any of that's confusing to you, go back to the original questions that I was asking. Have you ever had an experience other than now? Can you possibly have an experience other than now? How many nows have you experienced in your lifetime? Only one, this one. How quickly is now moving through time? How would you express that? How quickly does now move through time? Or is it just is? Yeah, I think those are some good questions to ask. Those are good things to meditate on. And again, thank you for having this conversation with me. If you have any questions that you want me to cover, or topics you want me to cover in the next episode, please let me know. Sorry, Terrestrial Traveler says you did a really well explaining this stuff. Well, thank you. I'm not sure I did, because I don't think it can actually fully be explained. It's really more about asking the right questions, and it's really, if any change is going to happen, if any aha moments are going to come, it's not because of something I'm going to say. It's going to come when you are thinking about these questions, and then you are going to have the aha. You're going to say, oh, whoa, right? And then maybe you're going to have a way to explain it and express it to yourself that if you shared it with somebody else, that might help them. You know what I mean? Like it's an exponential thing. It just kind of like keeps going. So I hope that is helpful. Yeah. Judy says, thank you, Keith. John says, thank you. Love you, John. Love you and Wanda. Miss you guys. Hope you're doing good. Again, thank you all so much. We will see you next week on Second Cup with Keith. And yeah, I thank you all for being a part of this. It's fun to bring back the podcast. And yeah, I love doing it. So thank you guys. God bless.